Welcome to Dark Horse Auto and Diesel. Today I'm going to show you how to do the rear brakes, the pads, and we're going to replace the rotor on a 2002 to 2005 Ford Explorer. Also, the process is the same for the same year Mercury Mountaineer and possibly the Aviator, the Lincolns. I'm not 100% sure on that. They did have a few differences, but it should be basically the same. Obviously, I've already got the wheel off. I'm not going to cover that. If you don't know how to do that, then you might not want to try this job. Now, this whole job here is a very easy job, and it's even easy for a beginner mechanic. So what I'm going to do first for right now, just to keep everything from flopping around, this is optional. I like to run 2 lug nuts up on it just to kind of hold the rotor in place. It's not required, but sometimes if the rotor's already loose, it can help a little bit, but yours might be seized on there. So the tools that we're going to need are very simple. Just a 10mm socket, a pry bar of some sorts, a wire brush to clean up some rust, and something to tie your caliper up with, because you don't want to leave it hang from the brake hose. And you're going to want to get yourself some brake and caliper grease and some brake cleaner. You may need a hammer to knock the rotor loose if it's seized on there. So first thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove these 2 bolts here. These are the 10mm. That's what's holding the caliper on to the knuckle here. And depending on which way your brake pads are oriented, one side has like an actual notch cut in it that fits around this. The other side is just smooth. And on these ones, the top one is a smooth one. So we're going to go ahead and completely remove the top one. If the smooth side is on the bottom, they're going to remove the bottom bolt all the way. And the coil spring tends to get in the way at times. There we go. Now we'll take our pry bar and just kind of gently work these off a little bit. They can get kind of stuck on there over the years, obviously. Just don't get too forceful with it. You don't want to break things. So go ahead and now that we got it loosened up enough, we should be able to take this bottom bolt all the way out. And the nice thing about the way these rear brakes are designed is you don't have to take a bracket off to remove the rotor like you do on the fronts and most brakes on most other vehicles. Now it's pretty obvious at this point why I'm replacing the rotors as well. They're just delaminating terribly. The other side was actually worse. Go ahead and get your caliper hung up. You absolutely do not want to let it hang from the hose. You will damage it. Take these off. Now your rotor should just come off. Yours may require some hammering. Obviously this one didn't. Back side looks terrible. And this is actually the one from the other side. It's no wonder there was noise coming from the brakes. It's just completely coming apart. They're factory original rotors with a little over 200,000 miles on them, and it's currently 2022, and this is a 2004 model year, so they're ready. Now you're supposed to have parking brake stuff in here. Some other idiot mechanic that was not myself decided that when they did a rear wheel bearing on it, they just took all that stuff out and never put it back in. So I should be replacing that today. I'm not going to today. That'll be for another time. A lot of times by this age they've fallen apart anyway and they don't work. So next what we're going to do is go ahead and pop these off, our little clips. Because you always want to reuse, or you always want to use new hardware. New brake pads always come with it. So now we'll take our wire brush and just clean up the rust on this stuff so that the new ones actually fit properly. Doesn't have to be perfect, just get the loose stuff off. Now we'll take and put our new little clip thingies on here. Now for the rotor. Now what you're going to want to do is take some brake cleaner and a rag and just wipe the surface off here on both sides, because there's a little bit of cutting oil on it to help prevent rust and storage. And before we put that rotor on, we're going to take our brake grease here and just put a little bit on here. You don't have to go all the way across because obviously the pads aren't going to travel the whole way. Just leave a little spot in the middle open. You don't want to just glob it on here either, because otherwise you may end up getting brake grease where you don't want it. Now we take our rotor, slide it on, being careful not to touch it on those little brackets that we just put grease on. Now you're definitely going to want to put a couple lug nuts on here. It just makes everything a lot easier when it's still. Next we'll go ahead and remove the outer pad here. Just take a pry bar or screwdriver and work at that a little bit, and then you can just grab a hold of it. That's not very good looking. Other side was worse, just like the rotor. Up here on the driver's side of the firewall is where you'll find the master cylinder right here. We'll just loosen that cap up a little bit. Don't have to take it off, just loosen it up. And now we'll take a C-clamp. I think I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the video. You'll need one of those too, or something to recompress this. And we're just going to leave the inner pad on there because that's up against the piston, and that'll protect the piston. Now this should go in very easily, or maybe a little bit of resistance, but nothing serious. Just screw it in until you feel a little bit of resistance when it stops. Now if this doesn't go in easily, that means that your caliper is sticking and it needs to be replaced, which I'm not going to go into that on this video. That's fully compressed. Go ahead and just grab a hold of it, pull it out. It's got these little fingers that lock inside the piston there. Wipe that rust and crap off of there. Now what we're going to do is pull these slide pins out and get a little bit of lubrication in there. You want to make sure these things are free moving. These are starting to get a little stiff, but they're not seized up, because the last person that did brakes on here was smart, myself, and used brake grease. These can be a little tricky to get out of here. It's kind of a weird design compared to most other brake systems I've worked on. So there's one of them removed. Just be careful not to mar it up too bad. Really, not at all would be ideal. Now we'll get a nice glob of brake grease on the end of our brush and stick it in there and just kind of smear it all around in there, focusing a lot on this area right in here where the metal starts. Don't go too crazy with it, just like with the other parts that we're going to grease. You don't want to get grease where you don't want it. Now make sure these don't have any debris on them. You're not going to be able to grease these pins, because as soon as you stick it in that rubber boot, it's just going to push all the grease right off of it. Just kind of work it on there, push it straight through. It's going to poke out the back side, make sure the boot gets locked onto it. Push it through until this side locks in, like so. Test it, make sure it's free, and do the same for the other pin. Now we're going to take a little bit of the brake grease and put it on the face of the piston here. This kind of helps prevent squeaks. I'm going to put a little bit on the inside here too, just to help with assembly and also disassembly later. All right, so now with your pads, you need to make sure that you have a matching set. They're not all the same. So what you're going to want to do is put them face to face like this and make sure that the notch is lined up with, like here, the notch is lined up with the notch, the smooth is lined up with the smooth. Well, they are different. You can screw it up to where you'll have one of one side and one of another. Now, as far as which way is best, whether the smooth part should go to the top or the bottom, I've tried it both ways. Either way works, although I have noticed that it does, at least in my experience, seems a little bit easier to remove and reinstall the caliper if you have the smooth part facing up. So all I'm going to do now, I've already got some on here, but just put a little bit of grease on these contact points here. You want to try to keep as much grease off of the pad surface as possible. Obviously, it's impossible to keep all of it off, but keep it to a minimum because that will diminish your brake performance and can cause premature failure of the pad. So now these little fingers are just going to lock into the center of the piston. And now I'll take some brake grease on the back side of these parts here. And you want to do that after you put the inner brake pad on, because otherwise when you're moving stuff around you might accidentally touch the back side of these fingers here and get a whole bunch of grease all over the front of the pad. And if you start getting too much on there, you can take some brake cleaner and just kind of spray it off a little bit. Now we take our outer pad. I've already got grease on it. Take and just slide it on. Now make sure your slide pins are pushed all the way to the back. Get this out of the way. Now we can go ahead and put our bolts back in. Now I don't know the torque spec for these bolts off the top of my head. Personally, I've been doing this stuff long enough, I can just go by feel. And in order to do it by feel, if you don't actually have a torque wrench, what you can do is get it to where you just start to feel a little bit of resistance. And then just give it about, another 45 degrees or so. You don't want these super tight because they are very small bolts, but you also don't want them to come loose. Now we can take these off. And next we'll just put our wheel on and torque our lug nuts down to, I think about 110 is what the book calls for. That's usually what I put them at. That's really pretty much all there is to it. Make sure you remember to tighten up your master cylinder cap for the reservoir. And very important, once you get your wheel on and get this back on the ground, do not put it in gear right away. Pump your brakes a few times. Don't push them all the way to the floor. With vehicles of this age, you can actually ruin your master cylinder by pushing it all the way to the floor. I'm not going to explain why, but it is a thing. I know, I've done it. So just light pumps, maybe a quarter, halfway down at most, because we've got these compressed backs, so there's not actually any pressure. When you put your foot on the brake, it's got to fill in all this extra space in here that we took out. So you want to make sure you have brake pressure before you put it in gear. Otherwise, you might end up rolling into the garage door or one of your kids or whatever. I've almost done that before too, way back in the day. So take it from my experience. Get brake pressure first. That's really all there is to this. Like I said, pretty simple job even for a beginner. Hopefully this helps some of you out and maybe gives you confidence to work on some other stuff later down the road. So thanks for watching.